Good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Joshua. I'm going to be your presenter today. We're here to talk about accounting, journal entry, and transfer transactions, or transfers and journal entry transactions. That's going to be the order that we're going to discuss these in Church Windows Accounting. So let's go ahead and launch into accounting here and talk about transfers and journal entry transactions. Two of the probably most important transaction types in the software. So transfers are found by going up to transactions in the upper left corner. It opens by default. Below that, we've got browse, enter income, enter bills, pay bills, transfer just to the upper left here. Let me get out my drawing tool here, and I'm going to point right up here to transfer right up there. There's our transfer page. Okay, that is where you access the transfers. Okay, so we're going to go on to that. This is really frankly, folks, I think an underutilized transaction type in Church Windows Accounting. One, either because folks don't know about it, that's probably the most common reason why, or they don't understand it. Okay, that they see it and they go, well, I'm not entirely sure what this transaction type does. Well, that's why we're doing the webinar event today, is because that we're going to offer some clarification on that. So transfers is pretty much as described, meaning we're transferring money from one account to another. And the real most important part of that detail with regards to that is that the accounts have to be of the same type. So a common use for transfers, and I do this use this transaction on my type on my support calls all the time, is when somebody calls me and they say, hey Josh, my church wants to be able to move money from checking to savings, or move money from checking to, we're purchasing a CD, we're going to move money from the checking into a new CD that we've purchased, whatever. And so that transfer transaction, this transfer transaction is perfect for that. Okay. So if, say, we're purchasing or moving money from checking to savings, for example, okay, if I didn't have the account, I'd have to add it to the chart of accounts, of course. But we're going to go up here and we're going to find our Huntington Bank checking account. Okay. So notice that once I've chosen the from account, the software automatically requires and will only permit me to transfer to another asset in this. So if we click the down arrow under two accounts, here's all my accounts receivable, client assets. But then as I go down, here are my other asset accounts: petty cash, money market. There's my savings account, my CD, my investments, my fixed assets. So we're moving money from checking to savings. So I'm going to choose my Fifth Third savings account. I then now will enter the amount that I'm moving from checking to savings. Let's say we're moving $5,000. And this, folks, is probably the most powerful portion of this transaction type, is because I'm posting money between transfers between assets, the software requires that I choose the payment method for how that is actually physically occurring. So here, if I need to print a check, notice here I've got manual check, computer check, cash, or EFT. So if I need to print a check, like I would if I were entering and paying a bill, I can choose computer check and put that into my print queue just like I were entering and paying a bill. Okay? So just be aware, folks, that this supports printing a check. If you're moving money between bank accounts and you need to print a check, you can put a check in the print queue, choosing computer check, and post and print a check just like you would normally. Or more commonly, maybe monies are being moved this way electronically, so you would choose EFT, or if you're handwriting checks, you would choose manual check. Okay, so I'm just going to choose computer check for the purposes of our webinar. Notice now check or reference number gets grayed out now, because that check number will be assigned when I go in to actually print the check, and I can enter any optional comments if I wish. So then when I click now done, add to batch, I show this to folks a lot. I'm going to do show running balance here in the upper right. We now show that Huntington Bank checking, the adjusted balance is reduced by 5,000. Fifth Third savings is now higher by 5,000. And I also like to confirm on these webinars, excuse me, folks, just overcoming a summer cold, so I'll get a little scratch in my throat there, that this transaction will reconcile on both of these asset accounts in the bank reconciliation perfectly. It will reconcile as a withdrawal from my Huntington Bank checking on my bank rec, and it will report and record on my Fifth Third savings as a deposit to reconcile. Okay, so I don't need to go in and do anything else to have these transactions appear on my bank recs for both accounts. This is doing exactly what I want. If that was all there was to it, I would simply click post from there. Okay. So the caveat to the transfers function, and so folks, again, as long as they're accounts of the same type, so asset to asset, liability to liability, fund to fund, income to income, or expense to expense, the transfer transaction will work for you. Okay. All right, so that's the key, is it's always going to require that you transfer money from one account to another account of the same type. Okay. If I need to post or move money between accounts of different types of transactions, of different types of accounts, say income to an expense, or expense to income, liability to income, something like that, then perhaps I would have to use like a journal entry transaction to do that. But if I'm doing transactions between accounts of the same type, then the transfer will work. So final thing about transfers here, okay, before we go in and we're talking about journal entries, is you have to continue to remind yourself that you're working with a fund accounting system, okay? We've got money that we go, okay, money is represented, stored in asset account and checking accounts, but we've got a fund account, so we're dealing with a fund accounting system. So whenever you're moving money between bank accounts, depending on how your chart of accounts is set up and designed, you may need to post a second transfer here between funds. And what I mean by that is my general operating fund right here to say my building fund, if that's indeed how my chart of accounts is set up. Okay. If your chart of accounts was set up and designed in such a way where checking account represented general fund, savings account represented building fund, etc., 1-to-1 ratio of assets to funds, you will need to do 2 transfers each time. The only way to know is to go in and look at your balance sheet. We recommend looking at the balance sheet, printing it before you post the transfer, then revisiting it again afterwards, and make sure that the funds and the assets look correct. Okay? If it doesn't, it may be that you missed a fund transfer. But assuming that I did, so I would do another similar $5,000 transfer between my funds. Notice no payment method is required, no check or reference number. I click Done, Add to Batch. Similarly, now notice we've got general operating fund is now lower by 5,000 and my building fund balance is higher by 5,000. Again, there's nothing set in stone about this, folks. It's all depending on how your chart of accounts is set up. Okay? If you've got, fewer funds and more assets, maybe depending on how your chart of accounts is set up, maybe a fund transfer is not required. Okay, but just keep in mind, you may need to do 2 transfers, asset to asset and fund to fund, when posting transfers between cash accounts. Okay, so I would go ahead and post this. So it's asking me, do I want to print? Now when I close out and I go back to say print checks, here in the middle, notice here, test bank name, I've got that in there as my name of my asset account for my savings, but there's my $5,000 check. Okay. I can now print a check and send that or take that to the bank and deposit that in savings. Okay. All right. So moving on with about 9 minutes, 10 minutes left here, transactions. other, and here we have our journal entry transaction. All right. So here's what I'm talking about down here is journal entry transaction. Just an FYI, folks, you've got another transaction up here called adjust asset, deposit correction, NSF checks, stock valuation changes, etc. That is also a journal entry, okay? But we're here to talk about the actual true journal entry transaction, not the adjust asset. Adjust asset just takes debits and credits out of the mix, talks about them as being increase or decrease. Well, we're here to talk about journal entries. So let's launch the journal entry window, okay? So right here, if I enter my date, it's always going to require that I enter the date first. I can enter optional comments. Here, so long as the journal entry transaction is balanced, folks, you can debit and credit as many accounts in one entry as you wish, okay? So that is the key, is you've got to just make sure that the totals right here in the middle, let me get out my drawing tool again here, and right here, and I'm talking about these totals right here in the very center, right there, okay, that those grand totals have to balance in order for us to be, the software to be able to permit us to add this journal entry transaction to our batch, okay? So let's say we debited an income account for a bill by mistake that should have been an expense account. So we're going to wind up crediting the money back to the income account, and we're going to debit the expense properly, okay? So we're going to say, all right, we debited a payment for something for our rental property to the income account, incorrectly. So we're going to credit that amount back. So we're going to say we, debited $350 to rental income that should have been charged to a different expense. And so the only way I can do that now is through a journal entry. I can't post anything between an income and an expense account any other way than through a journal entry, okay? So I put in my credit amount because I'm adding that money back to my rental income, okay? Now I would come up here and I would choose, say, whatever expense account I wanted to charge that to. Notice I can choose assets, funds, income, expense accounts, okay? So we're going to choose building fund expense, and I'm going to choose debit of $350 to that, okay? I cannot post a transaction like this between income and expense accounts, whether it was debit or credit to the expense or income or credit or debit, doesn't matter. I cannot post between an expense and an income account any other way than through a journal entry transaction, okay? Similarly, click Done, Add to Batch, Show Running Balance. We now show that rental income, right, is now higher by $350. Building fund balance is now higher. Expense account is higher, okay? So we have now added the income back into the income balance, and we've also now charged the $350 to our building fund expense the way that we want it to, okay? So this, I could post this transaction, and now, again, using the show running balance window to verify that the transactions are having the desired effect on the accounts that we want. All right, folks, I'm going to use that show running balance on calls with you all the time because it helps minimize mistakes. It ensures that what's doing the transaction or transactions are having the desired effect before we post anything. Okay, if it's wrong, I can close out of the running balance. I can move it back up to the top. I can make my changes to the transaction. Click Done, Add to Batch, clicking Show Running Balance again. Not going to post this until it's correct. A couple things about journal entries. Again, my debits and credits, if I add it back up, are balanced down here. Again, folks, it wouldn't matter whether I had 2 accounts or 20 accounts in this list, in this transaction. As long as those debit and credit totals are balanced, the software doesn't care, okay? 2 things. No payment method option on the journal entry transaction. So if you need to print a check or assign a check number, this may not be the transaction type for you, okay? If folks use journal entries, and I work with them on those a lot, If they need to record something like that, like they're writing hand checks or something, then they would have to put the check number in like line item comments or in the transaction comments. Okay. But if I'm needing a check or to record a check number, folks, I'm not going to use a journal entry for that. Okay. If you're living and working on a cash basis where basically you want to charge an expense and debit the bank for transactions, without involving, without utilizing accounts payable as the case may be, this would be your only way to do that. Okay. So I'm not recommending it. I'm just stating I've suggested to folks on support calls that you don't want to work with accounts payable, don't want to deal with vendors, and you're okay with not needing to be able to print checks or choose a payment method for that, then post journal entries, debiting the desired expense, crediting the bank, but that would be your only option to be able to do that. Okay. You can set up recurring journal entry transactions if you wish. Do I have anything in here? Oh, I do. Prepaid pledges and earnings on investments. So yeah, let's say I've got earnings on investments. So here I click that. We're going to paste that over. We're going to go we're going to click Done Add to Batch on our current journal entry, and we're going to move this one back up here. So we notice here we've got an income account and a gain loss on investment. I could do this under Enter Income as well, folks. But here I could go, well, you know what? I don't want to post that to my income account. Instead, let's choose maybe a fund. Okay. So right here, if I go, okay, my last quarter's investments were, let's go ahead and remove the income account. I don't know if I have that. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I click the down arrow and I go down to my 300 or up to my 300 fund balance accounts here. Where are they? Yeah, so down here, if I had an investment fund down here, a net fixed assets or some fund that represented that in that account, I can also post directly to a 300 account as well and bypass my treasurer's report with income and expense. Perfect if all I'm wanting to do is to reflect the change in value on my balance sheet without affecting or showing up on my treasurer's report as either income or an expense. Okay, so again, if I want to affect just in a fund and an asset account, the only transaction that will allow me to do that is my journal entry transaction or my adjust asset. I cannot go to enter bills, pay bills, to enter income, any other type of transaction and affect these two accounts directly. Okay. Similarly, done add to batch, show running balance, and we now show that Lynn Schwab Investments is increased by 123 and my John Joseph Memorial Fund is increased by 123.45 as well. Okay. So journal entries, we typically suggest that you try to explore using any other transaction types, folks, in church windows first before looking at journal entries. Journal entries can be tricky. I do a lot of hand-holding on journal entry transactions with folks, but I typically encourage folks to try to explore all other options. Why? Because journal entries oftentimes will permit you to post between the wrong accounts and get things wrong. Okay? You choose, say, another account instead of saying income and expense the way you want, or you choose, an income and expense when you meant to choose a different, like a fund or an asset or something else. Okay, when maybe other transaction types might be better suited for what you're trying to do or actually post to your accounts with. Okay, finally, journal entries, folks, have always been kind of determined to be a way or transaction types that are a method of being able to hide money. So this is why we encourage you to look at other transaction types because they tend to be more transparent and more clearly defined to affect the accounts that you're wanting to, when journal entries may raise a few more questions with folks as to why you did that. So that's the only thing we want to say about that. So, okay, so I would go ahead and post these transactions and I would go in and revisit my reports and make sure that they had the effect that I wanted them to have on that, folks. So that, everybody, is where we are going to leave the topic for today.